The heat inside the community hall on that last Friday of August pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, and 41 people sat in folding chairs that stuck to their thighs, waiting on the word of a woman most of them had spent the whole summer calling a fool. She stood at the front with her hands folded and her chin level, and she did not fill the silence, because she had learned that summer that the land does the talking if you let it. And so does a room. On the table beside her sat a single jar, its lid catching the last window light, and every eye in that hall was on it. The man in the pressed linen jacket, the one who had come down from the Regional Food Consortium with a leather folder and a smile like a slice of melon, kept clearing his throat as if he could clear the waiting out of the air. He could not. The verdict everyone imagined they were about to hear had in truth been handed down back in June, out in a field of split and blistered fruit, and the woman knew it even if not one of them did yet. So before the room learns what she chose, we have to go back to the beginning, to a day 13 weeks earlier when nobody in Harlan County would have crossed the street to shake her hand. Her name was Isadora Quill, and she was 34 years old. The June she came to the valley with everything she owned in a hatchback and a soft-sided cooler full of nothing but ice. She had cooked in other people's kitchens for 11 years. From a diner off a highway to a white tablecloth place that closed when the owner ran off with the register. And she had saved $4,200, which is not a fortune and is not nothing. And she meant to make it into a life. She rented 3 rooms and a barn on the far edge of a farm road for $200 a month from a widower who was glad to have anybody. And she stood in the barn her first morning and did the arithmetic of a person with more will than cushion. $4,200. Rent, gas, a used range she'd need, jars, salt, and every day the number would shrink unless she found a way to make it grow. That was the sum she carried like a stone in her apron pocket, and she turned it over 100 times a day, and she knew that a sum like that does not forgive many mistakes. The valley grew tomatoes the way other places grow weeds, in long, low fields under a sky that, in a good year, gave rain, and in a bad year, gave a white sun that hung too close and too long. That June, the sun hung too long. Isadora heard about the fruit before she saw it, standing in the feed store, listening to 2 men complain that the heat had come 3 weeks early and scalded the top of the crop. The fruit on the outer rows going soft and split and sun-yellowed on the shoulders, unsellable to the packers who wanted them round and red and hard as a fist. A grower named Buck Reynolds, who had the biggest operation on the valley floor and the loudest voice in any room, said he had 250 pounds of scald he'd give away before he'd pay to haul it to the dump. He said it laughing, the way a man laughs when he wants the whole store to hear how rich he is that he can throw away food. Isadora, who nobody had introduced to anybody, said from the end of the counter that she would give him $5 for it. The store went quiet the way a store does, and then Buck Reynolds laughed harder, because $5 for garbage was the funniest thing he'd heard all week, and he told her she could have it for $5 if she hauled it herself. And he told the men beside him that here was a stranger dumb enough to pay for what he was throwing out. She counted out 5 ones onto the counter, flat, and she said she would come at first light, and she walked out with the whole store, watching the door swing shut behind her. "A woman who works alone," Buck said, loud enough to carry, "buys spoiled fruit and calls it a business." The men laughed again. She heard it. She did not turn around. Being laughed at, she had decided long before that summer, is its own kind of answer, and it costs the one laughing more than the one they laugh at, though it takes a while to come due. She hauled the tomatoes in the back of the hatchback over 2 trips, and the smell of them filled the car. That thick, sweet, fermenting smell that is halfway between food and rot, and when she spread them across the long barn table, under the one bare bulb, her heart did something small and cold in her chest. Half of them were further gone than she'd hoped. The split shoulders had gone brown, the flesh underneath soft as a bruise, and she stood there in the dark of 10 at night with 250 pounds of what looked exactly like the garbage Buck Reynolds said it was, and she did the arithmetic again. $5 for the fruit, $60 for jars, a tank of gas. And she thought, standing there, that maybe the whole store had been right. Maybe a person could want a thing so badly she convinced herself of nonsense, and she sat down on an overturned crate and put her face in her hands. That was when she noticed the smell had changed, where she'd stacked the worst of them near the open barn door, where the night air moved. There, out of the pile, the split fruit had begun to give off something different, deeper, a smell like cooked sugar and warm earth, and she lifted one and split it with her thumb and touched her tongue to it, and the sun that had ruined it for the packers had done something else entirely. It had concentrated it. The scald had drawn the water off and left the sugar and the acid behind. And what would not sell round and red was, split open in the dark, the most intense tomato she had ever tasted. She sat back down on the crate, but for a different reason. She did not sleep. She sorted the whole 250 pounds by feel and by smell into 3 grades. Threw out only 19 pounds that had gone truly to slime, and by the time the sun came up, she had a plan that a wiser and better funded person might have called reckless. She would cook it down slow, all of it, low and long, into a sauce that tasted the way that first split fruit had tasted, and she would put it in jars, and she would find people who could tell the difference between fruit grown for shipping and fruit grown for eating. She had one pot big enough, and she borrowed a second from the widower, and she cooked for 2 days on the used range that took an hour to come up to heat, skimming and stirring and tasting, adjusting salt by the pinch, and at the end of it she had 31 jars of something so dark and thick and alive that she stood in the barn and cried, which she had not done in years, because she knew, the way you know a true thing, that it was good. She did not yet know that good is only half of it. That was the state of things when the old woman came down the farm road. Her name was Anna Voss, and she had come to the valley 60 years before from a village in the mountains of a country that no longer went by the name it had then, and she had buried a husband and 2 brothers on this ground, and she was respected and a little feared. The way people are feared who remember more than they say. She walked the mile from her place because she had smelled the cooking, she said, on the 2nd evening, and a smell like that carried a long way and did not belong to any of the growers she knew. She stood in the barn door with a scarf over her hair, and she looked at the jars and she looked at the woman who had made them. And she did not laugh, which after the feed store was a thing Isadora noticed the way you notice water after a long dry road. Anna Voss picked up a jar and turned it to the light and set it down. The land, she said, in the soft, rounded cadence of her old country, remembers what the farmer wants to forget. It does not forget the year the sun came close. It writes it into the fruit. Buck Reynolds, she said, and she said the name the way you'd name a stone in your shoe. He grows tomatoes to look at, tomatoes to travel, tomatoes that taste like a wet napkin because he has trained them for 60 years to survive the truck instead of the tongue. You, she said, and here she tapped the jar. You did not fight what the sun did. You listened to it. That is the whole of it. Most people spend their lives shouting at the ground and wonder why it will not answer. The ground only whispers, girl. You have to go quiet enough to hear it. And then she told Isadora the practical thing that changed everything, which was that the truly scalded fruit, the fruit nobody else would even give away, was the sweetest of all, and that Isadora should not buy the good tomatoes, should never buy the good tomatoes, should go to every grower in the valley and take the ruined ones off their hands for pennies, and let the sun's cruelty be her recipe. Waste, Anna Voss said, is only a thing a man has not yet understood. So the arithmetic changed. Where before, Isadora had one lucky pile of fruit, now she had a supply nobody else wanted, in a valley full of it, in a summer that was only getting hotter. She went to the smaller growers first, the ones without buck swagger, and she offered a nickel a pound for their scald, and they took it because a nickel is more than nothing, and hauling to the dump costs gas. She filled the barn. She cooked from dawn till dark, and somewhere in the 2nd week of it, she looked up from the range, and there was a boy standing in the doorway, maybe 10, in a shirt gone gray from too many washings, watching her with the still watchfulness of a child who has learned that being quiet keeps you from being noticed and being sent away. His name was Cyrus, and he belonged to the Halloran place. 2 farms over, the poorest ground in the valley, and his father worked another man's fields for a wage. And his mother took in sewing, and Cyrus had followed the smell the same as Anavas had, only he was too shy to knock. Isidora did not send him away. She handed him a spoon and a jar to hold, and he held it. And the next day he came back, and the day after that, and inside a week, he had appointed himself the keeper of the barn. He did not talk much, but he watched everything, and he had opinions. And it was Cyrus who started calling the different batches by names. This one, the dark one, that one, the sweet one, this pot here, the angry one, for the batch she'd let get a little too much char on the bottom, and it stuck. And Isidora found that a barn with a quiet boy in it was a wholly different place than a barn with only herself and the fear. He asked her once why she cooked the bad tomatoes when everybody knew the bad ones were bad. She told him the same thing Anavas had told her, that the sun hadn't spoiled them. It had finished them, and Cyrus thought about that for a long time. And then he nodded, like a man agreeing to a fair price, and he never asked again. She did not tell the valley how well it was going, and it was going well. She sold the first 31 jars out of the back of the hatchback at a farmer's market, 2 towns over where nobody knew her, and they sold in 90 minutes, and a woman came back for 6 more and asked, was there any way to get it delivered? Isidora came home with $186, and she did not spend $1 of it that she did not have to. She banked it, and she banked the next week's take, and she kept her mouth shut in the feed store where Buck Reynolds still made his joke about the woman who paid for garbage, and she let him make it because a fire kept low under the ash lasts longer than one you let roar, and she had a long winter to think of. Anavas had told her that too, in her own words. The one who shows all her cards, she said, is the one who goes home with none. So Isidora played the fool in town and cooked like a woman possessed in the barn, and the sum in the coffee can under the loose board grew from 4,000 dwindling to 4,000 rising. And she stopped turning the stone over in her pocket quite so often. The thing that lifts a person from getting by to getting somewhere is almost never the thing they plan. In the middle of July, a man in a dust-colored truck pulled off the highway to buy a jar at the farm market on a whim, because his own market stand 3 counties over had run out of the domestic sauce he sold to a string of restaurants, and he needed something, anything, to fill the gap. He was a broker named Delos, a lean, weathered man who had spent 30 years tasting other men's food for a living, and had a tongue that could not be lied to. He opened Isidora's jar in the parking lot and dipped a plastic spoon in it right there off the tailgate, and he went still. He did not haggle. He asked how many jars she could make in a month and what she'd charge for all of them. And when she named a price that felt to her almost greedy, he said it was too low and named a higher one himself because he could sell it, he said, for 3 times that to chefs who spent their whole careers chasing a taste exactly like this and could never find it because the growers who made it grew for the truck. He bought her whole stock on the spot and put down money against the next month, and he shook her hand like an equal. And he drove off, and Isidora sat down in the front seat of the hatchback and laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. Vindication, when it finally comes in the only language the doubters ever spoke, which is the language of a stranger's money, and she had it now in writing. It was around then that the smile in the pressed linen jacket first came down the farm road. His name was Roland Fesk, and he represented the Meridian Valley Cooperative, which was a grand name for a consortium of packers and shippers that had spent 20 years buying up the small growers 1 drought at a time and pressing them into contracts that paid by the truckload and rewarded exactly the wet napkin fruit Anavas despised. Fesk had heard, the way men like Fesk always hear, that some newcomer was moving product to a broker outside the valley without going through the co-op. And this was a thing the co-op did not like, because a valley that learns it can sell around them is a valley they do not own. He was warm. He was terribly warm. He admired her operation. He called it charming, and he offered as a kindness to buy her out entirely. The recipe, the barn stock, the broker's contact. For $1,100, which he presented as a rescue, a way for a struggling woman alone to get out from under a risky little venture with something in her pocket. He used that phrase, a woman alone. He said it soft, and it was meant to be a comfort, and it landed like a slap. And Isadora heard in it every laugh from the feed store, folded up small and made polite. She thanked him for coming. She said she wasn't selling. He kept smiling. But the smile had gone flat at the edges, the way melon goes when it has sat out too long. And he said he'd be back when she'd had time to be sensible about it. He came back 3 times over the next month, and each visit the offer changed shape, which is how you know a man's warmth is a tool and not a temperature. The second time it was a partnership. The co-op would handle distribution and take only 60%. Generous, he said, for a startup with no track record. The third time it was not an offer at all, a warning, dressed as friendly advice, that a woman running an unlicensed food operation out of a rented barn was exposed to all sorts of trouble, health inspectors, permit fees, and that the co-op had a great deal of influence with the county on exactly those matters, and it would be a shame, a real shame, if her little venture ran afoul of the rules. Between the visits, Isadora began to hear things in town, that her sauce was made from rotten fruit and unsafe to eat, that she'd made people sick, that the health department was looking into her, none of it true, and all of it tracing back, when she followed the thread, to the co-op's men. That was the second wave, the poisoned word, and it was uglier than the low offer, because you cannot buy your reputation back the way you can decline a check. She did the only thing she knew how to do, which was keep cooking. Keep the jars clean enough to eat off the lids, keep every receipt for every nickel of fruit, and wait. Anna Voss, when Isadora told her, only nodded and said that a man who cannot buy a thing will always try next to break it, and that the breaking tells you the thing was worth buying. Small comfort, but Anna Voss did not deal in the large kind. Then the valley started to burn, not with fire, but with the slower burning that a farmer fears more, because it comes without smoke and gives no warning you can run from. The heat that had scalded the outer rows in June did not break in July or August the way it always had. It sat. The reservoirs dropped, and the county cut irrigation allotments in half, and then in half again, and the tomatoes that Buck Reynolds and the big growers had trained for 60 years to travel well and taste like nothing began to fail all at once, because those varieties needed water the way a rich man needs his comforts, and there was no water. Whole fields went from green to brown in 10 days. The fruit that did set came in small and cracked and useless even for the packers, and the trucks stopped coming, and the co-op that bought by the truckload had nothing to buy, and the men who had laughed in the feed store were not laughing anymore. It came on the valley like the opening of a furnace door. That summer a wall of dry heat that took everything the water-fed rows had and left them standing dead in the sun. And in the middle of it, out on the poor dry edge of the farm road, Isadora's supply did not fail, because she had never needed the good fruit, because the scalded, drought-punished, sun-concentrated tomatoes that everyone else called ruined were exactly what the drought was making more of. And her recipe turned the valley's disaster into the one thing there was more of than ever. She understood it before the town did, the terrible arithmetic of it. The worse the drought got, the better her fruit and the more of it, while every conventional grower in the valley watched his year turn to dust. She could have named any price she wanted for what she made, and she knew it, and she banked that knowledge low under the ash, the same as she'd banked everything else and told no one. Delos, the broker, called and said the chefs were frantic, that in a bad tomato year, good sauce was worth its weight in silver, and he doubled his standing order and asked, half joking, whether she'd consider marrying him for the recipe. She kept cooking. The boy Cyrus was there every day now because his father's wages had stopped when the field he tended died. and Isadora paid him a real wage quietly, $1 an hour, and it went home to the Halloran table and was the only money coming into that house. She did not make a show of it, she simply set it in his hand at the end of each day, folded, and said good work, and the boy carried it home like a man carrying in a harvest. It was Buck Reynolds who came first, which surprised no one, who understood that the loudest man in the good times is the emptiest in the bad. He came up the farm road on foot in the 3rd week of August, because he had sold his good truck, and he stood in the barn door where Anna Voss and the boy had first stood, and he could not look at her straight. His whole operation had failed. He owed the co-op against advances he could not repay, and they were calling the note. And Roland Fesk had offered to take Buck's land at a price that was robbery, dressed as rescued the same trick, only bigger. Buck had heard, everyone had heard by now, that the woman who paid $5 for his garbage was the only person in the valley with a crop, and he had come, hat literally in his hands, to ask if she would sell him sauce he could bottle under his own label and sell to keep his family's land. He could only pay her a share of what he made, if he made anything, and he knew, he said staring at the barn floor, that he had no right to ask her for anything. There it was, the whole summer come around full circle. The man who'd laughed loudest standing in the mud asking grace of the woman he'd laughed at. And Isadora looked at him a long moment and thought about the feed store and the phrase, "a woman alone," and she felt the old cold thing in her chest, and then she felt it pass. She did not answer him yes, and she did not answer him no. She told him there was going to be a meeting. She had already decided by then, though she told no one, and the deciding had happened out in a field in June and not in any moment since. She sent word around the valley to every grower, large and small, that she would speak at the community hall on the last Friday of August about the drought and the fruit and what could be done. And she made sure the word reached the co-op because she wanted Roland Fesk in that room. He came, of course, because a man like Fesk cannot bear a gathering he does not control, and he came with his leather folder and his warm, flat smile, and he had a proposal ready, because he always had a proposal ready. Which brings us back to the hall, and the heat, like a hand on the neck, and the single jar catching the last of the light, and 41 people stuck to their chairs, waiting on the word of the woman they had spent a summer calling a fool. Roland Fesk spoke first, because he stood up before she could, and he addressed the room as if it were already his. He said the co-op understood the valley was suffering. He said the co-op had, through diligence and foresight, secured access to the one reliable source of quality tomato product remaining in the region, and that the co-op was prepared, out of its commitment to the community, to distribute that product to growers who signed exclusive marketing agreements. He did not once say Isadora's name. He gestured at her jar on the table as if it were an asset already logged in his folder, and he thanked her warmly for her cooperation, and he told the room that the recipe and supply would be managed responsibly by the co-op at prices the market would bear. It was a beautiful piece of work, smooth as a slice of melon, and half the desperate room began to nod, because a drowning man will grab the hand of the one who pushed him in. Then he made his mistake, the way greedy men always make it, by knowing one number too many. He said, to underscore how carefully the co-op had assessed the opportunity, that they estimated her operation at just over 300 jars a month, from roughly 1,100 pounds of input fruit. And the room did not catch it, but Isadora did, and so did the boy Cyrus sitting in the front row, because that 1,100 pounds was a figure she had told exactly no one, a figure that existed only in the private ledger she kept under the loose board. A figure a man could only know if he had been having someone count the trucks that came and went from her barn, if he had been watching her, measuring her, spying on the woman alone. He thought too small to notice him. She let the number sit in the air a moment. Then she said quietly, in a voice that carried in the stillness the way a true thing carries, that she was curious how the co-op had come by so precise a count of her private business, and whether the county knew its influence was being spent watching one woman's barn. Roland Fest's smile did not fall so much as it froze, and in the freezing, the whole room saw it for what it was. And you could feel the tide turn in that hall the way you feel the wind shift before the rain. Isadora did not raise her voice. She told them the truth of the summer, plainly. She told them the sauce was made from the very fruit they had all thrown away, the scald, the split, the sun-ruined culls that the drought was now making by the ton, and that any one of them could make it, that Anna Voss had taught her, and she would teach them, because the recipe was not the secret. The secret was only being willing to listen to what the sun had done instead of fighting it. She said she would not sign the co-op's agreement and would not sell them a single jar at any price, because a thing given to greed poisons the giver. And then she said the thing she had decided out in the field in June. She would sell her sauce and her stock to the growers of the valley, at cost, at the price of the jars and the salt and nothing more. Not 1 cent for the fruit and not 1 cent for the recipe. Because the fruit had cost her a nickel and the recipe had been given to her free by an old woman who understood that waste is only a thing a man has not yet understood. She would charge only for the labor of a person's own 2 hands, she said, because a gift you have to work for is a gift a person can keep his pride in. And she would teach any of them who wanted to learn, starting the following morning in her barn. There was a silence in the hall, and then Buck Reynolds stood up, the loudest man in the valley, and he took off his hat. And he said in a voice gone rough that he had called this woman a fool in front of the whole feed store in June, and that he had been the fool, and that he would be proud to work in her barn and learn what she knew. And one by one across that hall the hats came off, and the men who had laughed rose and thanked her, and the tide that had been running toward Roland Fest all summer reversed itself in the space of a single minute, and Fest gathered up his leather folder and his frozen smile and walked out the back of the hall, and no one turned to watch him go, which is the deepest contempt a room can show. A man. He never came back to the valley. The co-op, without a crop to buy, and a valley that had learned it could feed itself, folded its regional office by winter, undone not by any weapon, Isadora raised against it, but by the simple fact that decency, once a community remembers it, has some, leaves nothing for a predator to eat. The rains came in the 2nd week of September, the way they always come once you have stopped believing in them. 3 days of soft, steady water that soaked into the cracked ground and stood in the furrows and ran off the barn roof in a sound like applause. The valley healed slower than it broke, the way land always does, but it healed. By the next summer, the growers Isadora had taught were setting aside their scalded rows on purpose, and Delos the broker was buying from a dozen barns instead of one, and the valley that had made tomatoes to look at was becoming known, quietly, among people who cared about such things, as a place that made tomatoes to taste. Isadora bought the 3 rooms and the barn from the widower with the money in the coffee can, and it was her home now. Hers by law and hers by something older than law. And the boy Cyrus worked the summers there and grew up straight, and the Halloran land stayed in Halloran hands. The phrase, "a woman alone," got said about her still, but it had changed its shape entirely, the way a word will when a life fills it with a new meaning. And now it meant a woman who had come with nothing and needed no one's permission to become someone. And it was said with the tip of the hat. Anna Voss lived to see 2 more summers of it before she went to lie beside her husband and her brothers in that ground. And near the end she walked the mile down the farm road, one last time, on the arm of the boy Cyrus, and she stood in the barn door, where she had first stood, and looked at the rows of dark jars catching the light. And she said what she had said the first evening, only softer, because now it was not a lesson, but a benediction. "The land remembers what the farmer forgets," she said, "and it only whispers. So you must stay quiet enough to hear it. You stayed quiet, girl. You heard it." And then she took Isadora's calloused hand in her old one and held it a moment, and neither of them said anything more, because the true things had all been said already, out in a field of ruined fruit 13 weeks into one hard summer, when a woman everyone called a fool paid $5 for what the son had finished and listened, alone in the dark, to what he was trying to tell her.